There we go. Sorry. Jewish history and culture, anti-Semitism, and current events. It's a privilege to have both Adi Schwartz and Dr. Einat Wilf here to discuss their book, The War of Return: How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. So first, introductions, of course. Adi Schwartz is an Israeli researcher, academic, lecturer, and writer. He is a PhD presidential candidate in the Department of Political Studies and a research associate at the Center for International Communication, Bar-Ilan University. From 1999 to 2009, he worked as a staff writer on global affairs, politics, and Israel. He received his BA in history from Tel Aviv University and MA with distinction in political science and communications, also from Bar-Ilan University. He has published articles in the Israeli press, as well as in the Wall Street Journal, The Forward, Tablet Magazine, and the Jewish Chronicle. Mr. Schwartz has written extensively on anti-Semitism and is an expert on two of his main research topics, the Palestinian refugee problem and the history of Mizrahi Jews. Dr. Einat Wilf is an Israeli graduate of Harvard University, INSEAD in France, and holds a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge. Dr. Wilf served as the foreign policy advisor for Prime Minister Shimon Peres, worked as a senior fellow with the Jewish People Policy Planning Institute, and was a weekly columnist for the daily newspaper Israel Hayom. Dr. Wilf also taught social entrepreneurship at Sapir College and is a frequent guest on Israeli radio and television talk shows. Dr. Wilf entered the Knesset as a member of the Labor Party in 2010, and in 2013, joined the New Independence Party with Ehud Barak. She has written several books and spends her time, quite brilliantly, speaking publicly on Zionism, Israel, the conflict, and more. Thank you both so much for joining us today. To tune into more conversations like this one, make sure to follow New Zionist Congress on Twitter @NewZionists, Instagram @NewZionistCongress, and sign up to become a member of our organization at newzionists.com. That's New Zionist, plural. So Mr. Schwartz, on this discussion of the fabulous book, The War of Return, let me start with you for our first question. So in the book, you and Dr. Wilf assert that the conflict between Israel and Palestine can be boiled down to one thing: the Palestinian refusal to accept a Jewish state, manifest in their intransigent demand for the 1948 refugees and their descendants to return to Israel. Is this quote unquote right of return really a right enshrined by law? And if it's not, then why are so many people convinced that it is?
So first of all, good evening and thank you for having me. The short answer to your question is that no, it's not a right. And why has it? Why do people think so? Is because the Palestinians have managed to masquerade their political desire with legal format or legal rights, if you want. Now, if you want a rule of thumb, then you should simply know that there is no precedent for a country, a state, a sovereign state, that was forced to accept against its will anyone into its borders. So there's simply no precedent for that. And you have to differentiate between every country's rights and the immigration policy, for example. Every country has the right to decide who can enter its borders. But the Palestinians are talking about something completely different. They're talking about a international law, something above each nation's inner law, which supposedly grants them some kind of a right of return into the state of Israel. So there is no such right. And if you look at what the Palestinians are saying or how they explain that they do have this right, they use all kinds of arguments which are simply not true. I'll give you a few examples. First, they used a General Assembly, United Nations General Assembly Resolution 194, which was accepted in December 1948, which supposedly grants them a right of return. Now, there needs to be no much discussion on that because General Assembly resolutions do not constitute rights in international law. General Assembly is a much weaker and much lower body than the Security Council, for example, and General Assembly resolutions simply do not grant rights. Now, if you look at Resolution 194 and read it carefully, you can see that even that does not grant them a legal right. But again, General Assembly resolution do not grant legal rights. You can go on. For example, the Palestinians are quoting all kinds of legal covenants that were accepted much after the war, in the 50s, in the 60s. Some of them are relevant for citizens, which the Palestinians were resident of the British Mandate were never. They were not citizens of the State of Israel. So if you look carefully at each of the arguments that the Palestinians use to prove that they have a legal right, they don't stand, scrutiny. If you look at legal scrutiny, they do not, they're not valid. Now, the other question is perhaps even more interesting. How is it that so many people think that there is such a thing? So first of all, as we all know, that when you say many times, right of return, right of return, right of return, then people assume that there is such a thing. You know, we have been taught in history that when you repeat something enough, people are convinced that there's some kind of truth in it. But there's even more, I think, sophistication in that, because as we explain in the book, the Palestinians have gone through a few stages in their conflict with Israel. If you look back at the 60s or the 70s, if you look, for example, the PLO's basic charter from the 60s, it's very clear, their views are very clear. They want to have the entire land. They want to liberate the land with force. They want to bring all the refugees back. They want to put an end to the Jewish Zionist entity. Everything is there, is very clear. But if you look today and you listen to the PLO officials and everything they say, they don't speak like that anymore. Most of the time they speak about equality, they speak about freedom, they use other words which are much more relevant to the Western audience. Remember, in the 60s and the 70s and until 1989, the main patron in the international arena was the Soviet Union, which was much less interested in freedom, equality, etc., etc., etc. But since 1989, their main patrons in the international community are the United States and the EU. And you simply cannot come today to Washington or Brussels and talk as the PLO talked in the 60s. So for them to use legal language sounds much more acceptable. And you know, the thought is that when you go to the court, the judge doesn't care if you're a leftist or a rightist, if you're rich or poor, right? We know that justice is blind. How do you say that? So it's unbiased somehow. So if they say they have a legal right, it's not about politics. It's not about their ideology. It is something which is supposedly neutral. They simply have it, you know, just as we have the freedom of expression, etc., etc. Then for them, for the Palestinians to say, instead of saying, listen, we don't want that the Jews will have a state of their own. We don't want that the Jews will remain as majority in their own state. They talk about a right of return, supposedly a legal right of return. But as we know, the meaning of that is that massive amounts or a massive influx of Palestinians will enter Israel. Knowing the demographics, this means that the state of Israel becomes an Arab state. If a few million Arabs, Palestinians enter Israel and resettle, or whatever word you want to use, into the state of Israel, it's no more a Jewish state. It's no more the nation state of the Jewish people. So instead of saying this, as they said in the 60s, we don't want to have a Jewish state, we will never accept a Jewish state, they talk about a right of return, which sounds, since we are doing this Zoom meeting, they have succeeded. Because some people think that, well, you know, that's legitimate, we can discuss this, let's look at it, etc., etc. So they have managed to take their political, very aggressive position towards the state of Israel and, you know, mask it with a legal, even language, discourse, you know, about this resolution and this covenant and etc., etc. So in this sense, they have succeeded, and what I think Einat and myself we have tried to do in this book to put back, or if you want to take the mask down and to remind people that after all this is a political issue. It's not a legal issue. And again, I want a rule of thumb to everybody to remember. This is very short. There is no precedent for a state to be forced to accept anyone into its borders against its will. There's simply none. Okay, so that means that there is no right, because if there would have been a right, then people could enter any country they want. And there is no precedent for that.
Thank you. I was wondering if we could slip in a quick follow-up to that, just in light of current events in the news. So as we all know, there's tension in Jerusalem surrounding Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighborhood in which Jewish Israelis have laid claim to several pieces of property because they originally belonged to Jewish owners before 1948, and then were given to refugees on the condition that they revoke their refugee status. Now, if there is to be no right of return for Palestinian refugees to Israel proper, to the established state, is it fair that Jewish Israelis can then enter land east of the Green Line to claim ownership and return to land that was theirs before 1948?
My position, of course, is that absolutely not. I think this is one of the greatest heights of folly in terms of Israeli policy and legislation. The fact that the courts gave backing to this claim, in my view, is a massive mistake. Because a bit like Adi said, the general norm throughout the 20th century, I mean, the 20th century was a century where empires disintegrated and nation states were established, and this process was bloody. The establishment of borders on the back of deceased empires involved tens of millions of refugees fleeing across borders as these new states were created from the empires. We're talking Hindus and Muslims, Ukrainians, Germans, Poles, Bulgarians, Greeks, Turks, and of course, Jews, not just from the West Bank and Gaza, but Jews across the Arab and Islamic world, Arabs who lived here. I mean, this was across the world in the 20th century, and the norm was no looking back. You move forward. So yes, it's a tragedy. Yes, you lost your home, but the international norm and legal structure was no looking back, which is why there's no right of return in the sense of forcing populations to go into countries that don't want them because they've now established new states. And as a result, the whole issue of property, the general legal system around the world has been that you can negotiate compensation, but basically you do not take away the homes. I mean, even if a grave injustice has been done in the past, you can negotiate compensation, but you do not evict people. So Germans who moved into new homes, Poles who moved into new homes, Ukrainians, Hindus, Muslims who moved into homes that were inhabited by people who lived there previously. Yes, countries can negotiate compensation in various agreements, but you do not evict people once the borders have been established. Now here we go into, and I don't want to go into the weeds unless people want, of the fact that Israel after 1967 annexed Jerusalem, and supposedly Jerusalem is now part of Israel. And a lot of this is because of all these complications. But I think it should be very clear, and the court should rule in that way. The line is 1948. Whatever injustice was done, you can discuss compensation. That's okay. The people who own the houses, in an agreement, you can have a discussion as to who will be compensated. And I think in a future agreement, Jews who have property in Arab and Muslim lands should be compensated. Arabs who have property within Israel should be compensated. I think on balance, we will find that the greater compensation will actually go to the Jews rather than to the Arabs. But yes, that could be negotiated. But opening the 1948 file and saying it's all up for grabs is massive folly, precisely because the Palestinians, as Adi and I show in the book, the entire Palestinian project, I mean, this is their entire identity, is to keep 1948 open. Is to basically say, look, we may have lost the battle in 1948, but we're not saying that we lost the war. One day, as they say very openly, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. I always say in parentheses of Jews. I mean, their goal is very clear. So as far as they're concerned, the war of 1948 is not yet over. It could still be won to their cause, to the cause of Arab control of the entirety of the land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. So the entire Palestinian project is to keep 1948 open. This is why they are refugees generation after generation, basically saying, look, we are still living 1948. We may be citizens of Jordan, we may be citizens of Germany, we may actually be living in Ramallah or Gaza, but as far as we're concerned, we're still fighting the war of 1948 and we will still win it. For Israel to reopen 1948 and to basically say, look, we can backtrack is sheer folly.
Thank you. And I think that opinion should be spread absolutely far and wide right about now. And that kind of goes into my next question for you, Dr. Wilf. So you've made it clear in your writings and also in your lectures and speeches that UNRWA is a fundamentally flawed organization due to its classification of Palestinian refugees. I was wondering if you could elaborate on what makes the classification of Palestinian refugees and their descendants so different from that of other refugees around the world, and why is this distinction problematic?
So I had a colleague who used to half jokingly say that at the end of the 40s, early 50s, the United Nations established two refugee agencies. One was a massive success and one is a massive failure. The success is UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, and the failure is the UN Agency for Refugees, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Why is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees a failure? Because it started the 50s with tens of millions of refugees across Europe, across Asia, Africa, and today, none of them are refugees. So massive failure for an organization, whereas UNRWA started the 50s with several hundreds of thousands of refugees, and now it counts 5.5 million. So a great organizational success if ever there was one. So of course, this was like this tongue-in-cheek notion that says, if you're a refugee agency, your goal is actually to end the situation of a person being a refugee. And the UNHCR, and this also goes to the previous discussions, seeks to end a person's refugee situation in whichever way possible. Find them a home and citizenship in another country. Help them integrate in the country to which they fled. Send them back to the country if that country is willing to receive them. But the UNHCR doesn't sit for 70 years seething on the borders of a newly divided country or a newly established country saying, we will not settle any refugee until they resettle back in the country from which their ancestors fled. I mean, it was obvious for everyone in the 20th century that if this would be the thinking, war would never be over, because you would be creating generations of seething people with resentment who want to turn back the clock. And this is a recipe for war, which is again why the international law and norm were not no going back. Whatever tragedy, whatever happened, no going back. What UNRWA did is UNRWA basically created a loophole because it was a temporary agency that, and it's still temporary after 70 years, and basically allowed the Palestinians to remain refugees generation after generation, automatically passing this refugee registration on UNRWA's books through the generation. By now, the vast majority of those who are registered by UNRWA refugees were born after the war. So they were never born in the state of Israel. They never fled war. Many of them, most of them, do not even live in what are called refugee camps. The refugee camps are not camps in the sense of temporary housing after a predicament, but rather neighborhoods, some of them slum neighborhoods, some of them okay neighborhoods, but they're neighborhoods. They're permanent housing. They're not a kind of temporary refugee camps. But most those registered by UNRWA are not even refugees. And just so you get a sense of the entire absurdity, about 40%, so 2.2 million of those registered by UNRWA as refugees are citizens of Jordan. Jordan naturalized the refugees, and they became citizens. Everywhere else in the world, people who became refugees who were granted citizenship are no longer refugees. That's it. You cannot be a citizen of one country and still be a refugee from another. That it just doesn't exist, except for the Palestinians. Another 40% actually live in the West Bank and Gaza. They were born in the West Bank and Gaza. Certainly by their telling, they live in Palestine. They never left the mandatory land and mandatory designation of Palestine. So you have today a 30-year-old lawyer living in Ramallah, middle class, never displaced by war, registered by UNRWA as a refugee from Palestine. If they were born in Ramallah, how can they be a refugee from Palestine? Now that young lawyer knows the answer. He's a refugee from Palestine, from the river to the sea, in that sense. But why America or Europe have to fund that worldview, that's exactly the Western indulgence that we speak of in the book. A lot of other refugees, the ones who are registered in Syria and Lebanon, have long ago left. Bella Hadid tweeted today about what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah, Palestine forever. Bella Hadid's father, a multimillionaire playboy, citizen of America, living in the US, is still on UNRWA's book as a refugee from Palestine because he was born in a Syrian refugee camp. And UNRWA never takes anyone off its books, even if they became beautifully settled in America. And this is something that does not exist for any other population, because the UNHCR, the proper refugee agency, is actually trying to end the refugee status of refugees. And we bring a lot of examples of that in the book. Another great example I think that we bring in the book is a temporary refugee agency called UNCRA that was established for the refugees from North Korea to the south during the Korean War. Their numbers were about 3 times as much, about 2 million. The budget compared to UNRWA was about 1/3. And yet within a few short years, all of these refugees were settled. They were not placed in camps on the borders on the 38th parallel, seething and demanding revenge against North Korea. And here we have a bit of alternative history. UNCRA closes after a few years, having settled 2 million Korean refugees. And look at where South Korea is today. It could have been the Palestinians. But the Palestinians are mobilized for the project of winning 1948. So as far as they're concerned, they're not interested in moving on with their lives. And UNRWA allows them to remain in that limbo of 1948 forever.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilf. Mr. Schwartz, I wanted to go to you for this next one, which is kind of sort of a continuation of that answer. It's more focused on solutions, what comes later in the future. So let's say in a perfect world that the Palestinians were to accept today that there will not be a right of return and that they will accept a sovereign Palestinian state next to a sovereign Jewish state. Do we really think, depending on who the government is or what it's comprised of, that Israel will be willing to grant them the right of self-determination in the West Bank and Gaza? And alternatively, do we really think that Israel will, in any case, evacuate the settlers, or that the settlers will peacefully accept Palestinian citizenship, or that Palestine will accept a Jewish minority? In other words, if the impossible happened and that the right of return was relinquished, or the claim to the right of return was relinquished, where do we go from there?
Okay, so again, I'll give you the short answer. The short answer is yes, but let me elaborate on that. So let's take it in two parts. You asked me about, let's suppose that the impossible happens, right? So let's first talk about this. You have to a little bit open this up to discussion, because what we have is a group of people, the Palestinians, who were in the beginning called themselves Arabs and later Arab Palestine and later Palestinians, who for about 100 years or perhaps even more, 150 years, have been building their identity around resistance to Zionism, resistance to the idea of creating a Jewish state. So when you say, let's imagine that they accept the Jewish right to self-determination, that's a huge thing. This means that the entire conflict is basically over. So it's not just a technical issue of, okay, let's put these refugees here and these refugees there, and that's it. No, it's not. The reason that, I mean, we understood this, it took us some years, both me and Einat, it took us a few years to understand that the refugee issue is a microcosmos of the entire conflict, in the sense that, why are they still refugees? Because they do not believe that the Jewish state should be here. So everything here is connected. The moment that the Palestinian national movement, be it the PLO, whatever, you know what, the Palestinian society, go through some kind of process of acceptance of the Jewish right for self-determination, basically means that our conflict is over. From that moment on, the issue of exactly where to draw the borders is not that difficult. Now, I'll just give you a few examples. First of all, these borders are not sacred. I mean, if you look at the borders of the 1949, the pre-1967, what are they? This is the famous green line. This is where the Jewish forces, or the IDF at that stage already, and the Jordanian army managed to, meet each other in the midst of fighting. So let's say if the IDF was a bit stronger one day, then we would have 100 meters more. And if the Jordanians were stronger, then we had 100 meters less. This is how it goes in battle. So there's nothing sacred in exactly where the green line moves. So it's an issue of agreement. Now, if you look back at Israeli governments, and by the way, look at 2 years ago, 3 years ago, the Trump plan, whatever problem you can find in it, but there's clearly an issue of creating a Palestinian state. And I think there was something like 60, 70, 80% of agreement in Israel that this should be okay. The issue has never been about the Palestinian, or let's say not in the last 20 years. Perhaps if you go back to the 60s or 70s, Israelis would say, no, we don't agree for a Palestinian state. But now the question is not about the Palestinians having their own state. The question is about the Jews having their own state. So And by the way, if you look at Olmert and even Netanyahu, by the way, if you look at Netanyahu, 2014, when John Kerry was here on his, part of his plan to negotiate between Israelis and Palestinians, Benjamin Netanyahu negotiated for months on the basis that there's going to be a Palestinian state. Before him, Ehud Olmert suggested a Palestinian state. Before him, Ehud Barak suggested. If you look, for example, the disengagement plan from Gaza, which happened in 2005, right? Which was supposedly not supposedly, it was a hard decision. You had to take people out of their homes. It was obviously not easy. But a year afterwards, in 2006, there were elections in Israel. The governing party, Kadima, by then already Ariel Sharon was out of office and Ehud Olmert became prime minister, but he was the head of the same party. He won with an overwhelming majority. The Likud party of Benjamin Netanyahu, which was against the disengagement, reached a historic low of only 12 seats in parliament. So again, if you look at the hard data, the issue is not about the Palestinians having their right for self. This is, I think, the discussion of the 80s or of the 90s. And the big issue here and the big revolution that is needed is that the Palestinians come to terms with the fact that they're not alone here, that the Jews want to have a state of their own, and this is their right, and a Jewish majority will stay in the state of Israel. And there's also a process, it will not happen in one day. But I think that and this is, by the way, the process that Einat and me are wanting to create somehow, let's be by European pressure, American pressure, but this is the process that must begin. They must discuss, they must start talking among themselves. How long are we going to proceed with this? So the minute we see some kind of discussion like that, it's not an issue of days, not of weeks, but perhaps years. And slowly, perhaps, hopefully, they will reach the conclusion that, it's time to make peace with the Israelis. Then the atmosphere and the reaction of the Israelis will be completely different than what we see today. Nowadays, let's just assume that by the way, first of all, right now, you cannot reach any peace agreement with the PLO because they insist on the right of return. So there is no question, because no Palestinian can sign now a peace agreement without the right of return. So, there is no way to reach now a peace agreement. But currently, when you understand that the only meaning of, any achievement, look at what happened in Gaza, only using it in order to continue the war against Israel, instead of building their own lives, then of course Israelis are very reluctant and want to have a military, presence in the West Bank, which we all know, by the way, that is preventing a lot of terror attacks against Israelis. But if the atmosphere would be very different, then I think the reaction and the attitude of the Israelis would also be very different.
Thank you. And Dr. Wilf, this is sort of a continuation of the same question, because it's something that you've spoken on quite a bit, and how you recall how in the 80s and 90s, as Mr. Schwartz said, these ideas of the 80s and 90s, the Israeli left was electrified and inspired by the concept of land for peace. Now, many say that the Israeli left has collapsed because the solution or the dichotomy of land for peace has collapsed, and many on the left have come to view that as a fallacy. Do you share that point of view? And I'm wondering if you could speak about your journey as to what led you to realize that, if it is in fact true.
Certainly. Once the left, in the 70s, but especially in the 80s and 90s, the Israeli left recreated itself from emphasis on socialism to the party of peace. And it had a very simple message. The path to peace is straightforward. All that Israel has to do is hand over land. Which land? Land that Israel captured in 1967, Golan Heights in the north, Sinai Peninsula in the south, Gaza and the West Bank in the center. If Israel would hand over those pieces of land to its Arab neighbors, Israel would have the peace that eluded it when it was established in 1948. Since Arab countries failed to defeat Israel in 1967, they were now ready to finally make peace with Israel, but they just wanted the land from 67 back. That was the notion. And for a while, this really seemed to work. I mean, the entire peace with Egypt was based on land for peace. After Sadat came to the Knesset and spoke of peace, Israel negotiated the complete, full, down to the last square inch withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula, took away the settlements that were there, gave it back entirely, and in return got a peace agreement with Egypt. I think 40 years later, it's not much of a peace, but it's a peace agreement. I think it's mostly a non-belligerent act, but sure. But for a while, this seemed to really work. The 1990s were really the heyday of land for peace. Israel was negotiating with the Syrian over the Golan Heights. We signed a peace agreement with Jordan when Jordan gave up its claim to the West Bank. And of course, the highlight of the 90s was the direct negotiations with the PLO through Oslo over the future of the West Bank and Gaza in the direction of establishing their Palestinian state. Now, at the end of the 90s, when Ehud Barak, a leader of the Labor Party, goes to Camp David, the symbolic retreat where peace was negotiated with Egypt based on land for peace, he puts on the table a proposal, later codified by President Clinton, his parameters, that checked all the boxes of what the Israeli left, and I think much of the world, believed was what the Palestinians wanted. So a fully independent Palestinian state. So if people tell you that the problem is the occupation, that was going to end it. The Palestinian state was going to have no settlements. Settlements were going to be dismantled or exchanged for equivalent land. So if people tell you there's no peace because of the settlements, settlements were not going to be a problem. East Jerusalem, including holy sites, the ones that are now in the center, were going to be part of Palestine. So if people tell you that Jerusalem was the problem, that was going to be part of Palestine. All the Palestinians had to do was sign on the dotted line, say yes, self-determination, full statehood, no settlements, no occupation, capital in East Jerusalem. What do? They walk away. Arafat walks away. Later, Abu Mazen walks away from a similar proposal by Olmert in 2008. And not only do they walk away to no criticism from their people, which means that by walking away, they carried out what their people wanted. Because otherwise, you would expect at least one op-ed that says, Arafat, Abu Mazen, are you insane? Go back there into the room and get us that state. No, they walked away from those proposals to no criticism. And of course, it was followed by violence, truly bloody, murderous violence in 2001, 2, 3, 4, and some violence in 2008, 9. But this left Israelis with a very simple question. Certainly Israelis of the left, like Adi and myself at the time, saying, so what did the Palestinians want? Seriously, they were offered everything that we were told they wanted, and they walked away. So intuitively, we realized that they probably want something else. And that's when Adi and I, each in our own paths, and ultimately we met, began to research, to explore, to meet with Palestinians, only to realize that the answer was staring us in the face, that the Palestinians wanted what they've always wanted, from the river to the sea. We just wanted to believe something else. So we just didn't listen to what they were telling us all that time. Now, naturally, this led to the political collapse of the Israeli left. Because the Israeli left, like you said, had an inspiring message. We can have peace. Just get rid of this land. I mean, growing up, I hated settlers. I felt that they were standing between me and peace. And because peace was going to be so simple, get rid of the settlements, give back the land. When this completely collapsed, what is a political leader of the left going to say? Let's negotiate with the Palestinians, but nothing's going to come of it because they want all of the land. I mean, that's not an electrifying political message that people will rally behind. So the Israeli political left collapsed, but also the Israeli right collapsed. Those who wanted Israel from the river to the sea, those who wanted to annex the West Bank, those who said this is all ours, they've also lost whatever support they have. And today, the Israeli right, in the traditional sense, those who think that Israel should annex the West Bank, and the Israeli left, those that think that we can have peace if Israel would only give up the West Bank, they are marginal forces in Israeli politics today. The vast majority of Israeli politics is in this central blob, which is neither right nor left. It basically says, we're not going to do anything because the Palestinians want everything, so that's a no-starter. But if one day, I mean, I can tell you, I once gave a lecture, and I always say that I'm a leftist still, and a woman came up to me at the end of the talk, and she said, you don't sound like a leftist. Leftists don't talk like you. And I said, I'm a leftist in the sense that I believe that if there will be a chance for true peace and the Palestinians will finally come to terms with the equal right of the Jewish people to self-determination in part of the land, I will support the partition of the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state as envisioned by the UN, and the establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And this woman from the right said, but I believe that too. So it's almost become a sociological thing, but most Israelis, like Adi said, if they realize that finally the conflict is over, that the Palestinians are closing the file of 1948, that they understand that there's no going back, that they can have a state in part of the land, but not in all of the land, they will find Israelis more than willing to divide. And I can only bring a recent example. Remember last July, when everyone talked about the evil, annexing, gobbling Israelis just waiting to take over all of the land? Then came the Emiratis and say, look, if you don't annex, you can fly to Dubai and do business here. And Israelis dropped annexation like a hot potato. I mean, they couldn't fly to Dubai quickly enough. So except for 5 settlers who thought that we lost a tragic historic opportunity to annex the West Bank, most Israelis couldn't care less. Most Israelis clearly preferred flights to Dubai over annexation of the West Bank. And this is a permanent feature of the Zionist movement. If we can have peace, but the price is land, we will pay it. We will not pay the price of our existence, but we're definitely willing to partition the land for peace.
I think this summer was a great example of the panic of, I mean, American college students, Jewish American college students were hysterical over having to contend with this, and it was everywhere, and oh my God, Israel is just the bane of all of our existences, and how are we supposed to explain this? And then all of a sudden it went away, and I feel like there hasn't been enough reflection on why it went away. The Israeli hunger for peace. And like you said, they couldn't, I mean, I was every time I go on Instagram, I tap through so many Israelis on planes, so excited to be traveling to the Middle East. And there's a reason why all of that happened. So that's a really incredible answer. Thank you. Okay, so Mr. Schwartz, you, or in the book.
You can call me Adi, it's okay. Adi is good.
Yeah.
I wrote it.
It's fun, yeah.
I wrote it as Mr. Schwartz. I just wanted to be as formal as possible. So Adi, in the book, towards the end, there are solutions that are brought forth. One of the solutions, of course, the main one, is defunding and dismantling UNRWA. To Western ears, even Western ears inside the Biden administration, who claim to be very, very pro-Israel and very pro-settling on an agreement that would result in peace, or end in peace, that sounds shocking and horrible because we don't want to take away their humanitarian aid while they still don't have a state. we don't want to come across as the bad guys by dismantling something that postures itself as helping Palestinians. So what would, in a perfect world, if UNRWA was dismantled and we did look like the bad guys, what would go in its place to ensure that humanitarian aid was still being offered and still being delivered, but that the issues surrounding refugees would cease to exist?
So let me start by telling you a short story that we were monitoring Palestinian media and Palestinian reactions when the Trump administration decided to stop the funding of UNRWA. And what we saw was very interesting. We saw some op-eds and reportage, and none of the Palestinians that were writing or that were quoted, none of them said, oh my God, they're going to take away our clinics or they're going to take away our schools, you know, because UNRWA is basically providing social services. But that was not the complaint. The complaint was, oh my God, they're touching our right of return. So this is the heart of the matter. For the Palestinians, UNRWA is not humanitarian aid. Perhaps it is also humanitarian aid, but for them, UNRWA is a sign that the international community accepts their narrative. A, that the 1948 war was injustice, that the creation of the state of Israel was injustice, that their whole refugeehood is a, you know, such an injustice since the times of the Bible, etc., etc., etc. Again, as Einat said, refugees were all over the world, but for them, UNRWA is the perpetuation, is the tool for the perpetuation of that phenomenon. Now, what we are suggesting is very simple. Differentiate between politics and social services. We have no problem that the West, the United States, the European Union, whoever wants to do it, wants to donate money, wants to give money to Palestinian schools, clinics, whatever. You know, most of these countries, most of the Western countries are giving out foreign aid to countries in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. It's a common procedure. They can continue doing it. Also, Gaza, in the West Bank, etc. Our problem is with politics. These people should not be considered refugees because they are not refugees. There is no reason to connect the two. You can continue and give them aid without providing them this card that they are refugees from Palestine, which we all know that this is where Einat and I live, and not Ramallah and Nablus, right? For them, returning to Palestine is basically reclaiming Israel of the pre-1967 borders. So we want to end this. We want no more refugees, no more UNRWA, and there are so many ways to do that. By the way, just as Europe aids people in Haiti or in the Congo, they don't necessarily designate them first as refugees. There is no connection between giving aid and designating people as refugees. So this is the solution that we are suggesting. In the book, we provide a few more concrete, you know, I'll just give you an example. Jordan, all right? The Kingdom of Jordan. It has its sensitivities that we can discuss, but it's a functioning country, right? Jordan has its schools, has its army, has its schools, and next to it, there are schools of UNRWA. There are clinics of UNRWA. So what we suggest, if, for example, the United States gives 100 million per year for UNRWA activities in Jordan, simply give those $100 million to the Kingdom of Jordan, to their budget, and Jordan can take over all the facilities, all the clinics, etc. So we are not interested in any way of, you know, downgrading or harming Palestinians that they should go. By the way, just think of it. If you have today a school of UNRWA in Ramallah, okay? What we suggest is that the money, the budget, should simply go to the PA, to the Palestinian Authority. in physical terms, nothing happens. I mean, kids get up in the morning, go to the same school, the building will remain the same building, the teachers will be the same teachers. Just at the end of the month, they will get their salary not from UNRWA, but from the PA. That's it. The only thing that the US needs to do is to transfer the budget not to UNRWA, but to the PA. By the way, that's supposed to be a classic nation-building procedure, right? Why, for so many years after the creation of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, you still continue with the United Nations competing agency for already 30 years? And by the way, huge. If it's not something, you know, one village or something, it's huge. It's all across the West Bank. What's the purpose of that? What's the logic of that? I mean, nobody can understand that. Nobody can explain it, except for the reason that they are very serious about maintaining their being refugees from Jaffa, from Haifa, etc., etc. Now, I mean, I can understand the Palestinians. This is their ethos. They have to, you know, people don't change their mind just because, you know, they get up in the morning and, okay, you know what, I don't want the whole land. Nah, I don't need it, you know. No, they change their mind when they have no other choice. By the way, this is exactly what happened to the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement also had to, you know, make compromises because the choices were worse. So the Palestinians have to get a very clear message. There is no such thing as a dream of return and refugees going back to Jaffa. Where to start? What the best way to start? Stopping this fantasy of UNRWA. Social services or providing any kind of aid has nothing to do with it and can move along and can continue without any problem. So if, you know, if someone is concerned about himself being a good person, no problem at all. I mean, aid can continue, clinics and hospitals can go on. We just don't want the political dimension. This is what we want to prevent.
What has to happen? What has to happen for the Biden administration and the EU and Western powers to understand that? And if they already do understand it, because sometimes I think they actually do, then why is it not happening and why is this continuing?
Einat?
What they have to do, of course, is read our book. Because I think, I actually think, I mean, if I'm allowed, by now we have enough responses to the book that I think we can speak to it. I mean, people read it, and like you said earlier, a light bulb goes out. I mean, they understand it. It becomes so clear, so obvious. There's, I think it's called Occam's razor. There's this notion in science that if there are two theories that explain something, you go with the one that's simpler. So you have so many books and essays on why there's no peace. Ehud Barak did this, and he wasn't nice to Arafat when they sat at the table, and, you know, so many excuses. But then at one point you're like, but just a moment, there's a really simple explanation. The Palestinians have been remarkably consistent, to their credit. They believe the very establishment of a sovereign state for the Jewish people in the land is a grave injustice that should be undone. That's their worldview. And it's also amazing, Palestinians who have reviewed our book, obviously they're angry about our recommendations, they're angry about the fact that we show that the right of return is not a legal right, but they never disprove our main thesis that the insistence on this return is the fundamental element of Palestinian identity. If anything, Palestinian reviews of our book amounted to the word duh. Like, what took you so long, Israelis? I mean, we've been saying it all along. Why, you know, how come you didn't realize it? How come you didn't figure it out? So the Palestinians have been very consistent, and the explanation is very simple. There's a quote that I love to use by Ernst Bevin, the foreign minister of Britain, during the time of the mandate. If you know anything about it, he didn't love Jews and he didn't love Zionists, so he certainly was not on our side. And Bevin goes to the British Parliament. He has to explain to the people of Britain and to the Parliament why Britain is sending back the mandate to the United Nations, to the heir of the League of Nations that gave it the mandate. So he basically says His Majesty's government has come to the conclusion that the conflict in the land is irreconcilable, okay? Irreconcilable. And then he goes on to explain why. He says, look, there's Jews, there are Arabs, and he says this: what the Jews want is a state in the land. What the Arabs want is for the Jews not to have a state in the land. Now, it's a fascinating definition of the conflict, which explains everything till the present day. And it explains why the conflict has not been solved yet, because it's not about borders. He doesn't say, look, the Jews want a state, the Arabs want a state, but they have difficulty drawing the border in Jerusalem. No. He says the Jews want a state in the land, which means they're willing to have some of it rather than all of it. And the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. That's the top priority for the Jews is statehood. The top priority for the Arabs is no Jewish statehood. Now, if you go to the present, and if you go at any moment in history, this is Occam's razor. This explains everything. This explains why at every critical juncture, Israeli leaders from the right and the left agree to partition. And this is why Arabs, Palestinians, at every juncture do not agree. Now, from their perspective, by the way, they're not irrational. They look at the region, Arabs, Muslims, 60 times the Jews, 100 times if it's the Muslims. From their perspective, they see no reason to compromise with a tiny people with a crazy story as far as they're concerned. They believe, not irrationally, I cannot rule out that they will be proven correct, that given enough time, the land will become Arab. The land will revert to being Arab, as it has been since the 7th century Arab conquests, and therefore they see no reason to compromise. And this is the amazing problem. You said, why don't people realize it? Because people have gotten the underdog completely wrong. What determines the conflict is numerical ratios. One of my favorite figures to quote is that when Israel was established in 1948, the ratio of Jews to Arabs in the region is 1 to 50, 50, okay? So the Jews, very much aware that they're a minority, what do? They ask for Jews to make aliyah. Huge success. Over 3 million Jews came in the last few decades. Jews make a lot of babies, right? We're the most, we have the most babies of any country of our wealth level. Great. Jews today are more than 10 times their number in 1948. Do you know the ratio of Jews to Arabs in the region today? 1 to 60. We literally did not make a dent in it, which really tells you that there's no amount of immigration or procreation that will ever get the Jews out of their status as an ethnic, national, religious minority in an Arab and Islamic region. As a result, Jews always compromise and Arabs never compromise. I mean, it's really simple. It's not about one side being good and one side being evil. I always reject any notions that this is a conflict between good and evil, good guys and bad guys. It's a conflict between small guys and big guys. Really simple. You have a small minority that I can assure you, if there were 1 billion Jews, we wouldn't compromise. We wouldn't be nice. But we're not 1 billion, so we compromise. And the Arabs are nearly 500 million, and the Muslims are nearly 1.5 billion, and they really don't understand why they need to compromise. So this is inherent. So the underdog here, with all our tanks and airplanes and whatever, we still remain the underdog. And one of the greatest successes, and Mati Friedman also speaks about it beautifully, one of the greatest successes of the framing of the conflict was to make it about an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because then you get everything wrong. Once you understand that the Palestinian attitudes to Israel and to the Jewish sovereignty is the tail end of the Arab and Islamic attitude to Jewish sovereignty, and is only sustained as long as Arabs and Muslims support that, then everything becomes so obvious and so clear, which is also why the path forward is for hopefully both the Arab world and the Western world to remove their blank check support of Palestinian rejectionism, which will force the Palestinians to their real size, which will then force them to a compromise. As long as the Palestinians believe that they are spearheading Arab and Islamic or even Western resistance to Israel, they're not going to compromise.
Absolutely. Absolutely. How do we get you two on every single college campus ever in the United States? We should probably work on funding that. Thank you.
And Zoom is always available.
Always available. Yes, that's correct. Thank you very much for that question. So this is, I wanted to pose this is the second to last question, and I wanted to pose the last two to both of you. There is a very seductive trend, especially in liberal circles, in academic circles, led by people like Peter Beinart, who offer a solution that says we are living in a one-state reality, that there is a system on the ground that is akin to apartheid, if not in intent, then in effect. There is a denial of rights to people. There is a clash between nations that has become too extreme and too convoluted to separate by a border, and the two-state solution is dead. This argument that the Jewish state will cease to exist in its current form used to appear very violent, and it sounded like it came from the right. It sounded like it was imperialist and colonialist. But now, because many Jews and many Jewish organizations, many who have attracted young people to their ranks, it sounds like the civil rights movement of our era, and is in fact coupled with a lot of civil and social justice movements, especially on the campus. Why is this still a solution that is not desirable? Why is it a solution that is not obtainable? And is it really, as some would go so far as to say, anti-Semitic?
I can start and you will add, Einat?
Sure.
Okay, so let me start with my ideology, okay? I want to live freely. This is what I want. And the only way I can live as a free citizen with all the rights which are customary to Western countries is to live in my own country, meaning led by Jews, the nation state of the Jewish people. Now, perhaps there's some kind of a misunderstanding, especially when you talk with people from the United States who have some kind of difficulty to accept states which are based on nationalities. Because perhaps in the United States, you can say that, well, we don't have, our country is not based on a particular nationality or ethnicity. We used to have Irish people and Italian and Jews, and now we have Puerto Ricans, and we have people from Africa and from Latin America, and we're just this blend, and perhaps our only allegiance is to our constitution or something like that, right? But this is not the case, not in Israel, not in Europe, not in many other countries. Here we don't have a supranational identity. Here we have either a Jewish state or an Arab state. So it's not going to be a neutral state. By the way, when you look at all the suggestions, you know that in the last decade or two, some Arab citizens of Israel have also been talking about this notion of a state for all its citizens, which sounds differently here in Israel and in the States. I can understand totally why in the States it sounds like Martin Luther King is just fighting for equality, but here it's not the same. Because when you look into their program, what do they want to do, for example? To use, instead of Hebrew names of all kinds of cities, to go back to their Arab names. Instead of using Jewish holidays, we're going to have Arab holidays. So it's not going to be a neutral state. There are no neutral states in this area. There's one Jewish state, and then there are many, many, many other Arab states. Now, I'm certainly in favor, by the way, the reason I very easily accept the right of the Palestinians to self-determination is because this is what drives me. I want to have my right to self-determination. I want to live in a state of my own. And I can certainly understand why Palestinians in Ramallah or in Hebron do not want, a Jewish state to run their lives. I can understand it perfectly. But I want to have my own state. So this is, generally speaking, my ideology. This is why I think it's not a fair suggestion. To your question, whether it's anti-Semitic or not, the question is whether the person that is suggesting that is generally against nation states. If your position is, well, listen, we have to abolish all nation states. Italy, for the Italians, that's crazy. Why should not all the people from Zimbabwe go to Italy? All the Italians to Zimbabwe, let's have fun, everything is good, abolish Czechoslovakia, Slovenia. It's ridiculous. If this is the perspective, and Israel is just one in a long list of countries that you think should be abolished, I can argue with you, but I don't think it's anti-Semitic. It's a very general view of how to run things. But if you have an obsession only with one country and only its nationality is very concerning for you, then yes, I'm sorry to say that you're prejudiced against that nationality. And, prejudice against Jews means anti-Semitism. So I can't accept anyone who is dealing seriously with creating one state is also a euphemism. We have written, Einat and me, we have written an article that was published about half a year ago. I don't even remember. Everybody was saying, like Peter Beinart, saying, well, the two-state solution is dead. And well, listen, guys, the two-state solution was never even born. As we just explained in this last hour, the Palestinians were never on board. They always wanted one state. They always wanted that the Jews would not have a state of their own. So first they did it by force. Then they, tried to have their right of return and have a massive influx of refugees. And now they call it a one state. These are all the same. These are synonyms for the Jews not having a state of their own. And if someone accepts this aggressive, violent notion as the height of the civil rights movement, well, this is something that I can't accept. And just one more thing. Again, if you look at the program, the pamphlets, Arab citizens of Israel, Israeli Palestinians, whatever you want to call them, for example, they want to change the flag, right? They want to change the flag of Israel. It shouldn't be Star of David. They want to change the anthem, etc., etc. To the best of my knowledge, this is not what Martin Luther King asked for. I don't think that he wanted to change the American anthem or to change the American flag. He really, I think, wanted equality. He didn't want supremacy over any other citizen of the United States, but this is what the Arabs actually want. They want to have supremacy over the Jews. Again, this is not my idea, not of civil rights, not of progressive thinking, not of anything. So I can't accept it as anything other than simply biased or anti-Israeli, very aggressive position.
So I'll just add quickly, I mean, it is very frustrating to speak often to Americans who bring their own views. And the amazing thing is what Americans often fail to realize is that their country is the exception rather than the rule. Israel is the rule. Israel is a normal country where you have a dominant national majority with a minority. And the question of majorities, minorities in various countries is handled, by the way. If you look, the EU has like a checklist to how to deal justly with ethnic, religious, national minorities. I mean, the Arabs are very clear about their identity as an Arab national minority. Israel comes out of this list. It checks all the boxes with flying colors. Schools in Arabic and Arabic signs everywhere, and the ability to take vacations on their holidays. And I mean, Israel really is at the top of how countries manage national minorities. By the way, because the Arab minority belongs to the dominant majority in the region, and we really can't afford to mess with it too much. But what Adi said is the most important thing about the story about the one-state solution is this kind of sob story of like, there was once a magical fairyland where the two-state solution was possible. And Palestinians wanted the two-state solution with all their heart. And evil Israel built settlements, and now the two-state solution is dead. So first of all, anyone who knows, from Oslo to the present, nothing has changed in the ratio of Jews to Arabs in the West Bank. It's the same ratio, the ratio of settlement land to not, I mean, it's amazing. So if a two-state solution was possible in the 90s, it's possible today. Nothing has changed, amazingly, as much as we're told settlements are gobbling up land. They're not. But there was never a moment, not a single minute, when the Palestinians accepted the two-state solution as in a Jewish state and an Arab state. The only two-state solution they ever accepted, and this is where we go back to the right of return, is an Arab state in the West Bank and Gaza, and an Arab state that will replace Israel through this mechanism of refugee descendant settlement. So there was never a true acceptance that the purpose of partition of the land is to enable the Jews to exercise sovereignty in some of it. So the goal of the Palestinian Arabs was always a single Arab state where the Jews will live as a religious minority. Palestinians never accept the idea that the Jews are a nation and a people, but rather only a religious minority. And in their mind, there's no problem for Jews to live as a religious minority that knows its place among an Arab majority. So to Americans, to the West, Palestinians speak of rights, but the only rights they want is the right to undo Israel. They speak of justice, but their only justice in their mind is the justice that annihilates Israel. They speak of equality, but in their mind, equality just means not two equal nation states, but equality that erases the achievements of the Jews in achieving sovereignty. So it's all about using words that Westerners interpret in one way, but Palestinians know exactly what they mean and to what end they're intended.
Yep. Thank you.
Can I add something?
Of course, of course.
Yeah, quickly. Einat reminded me an anecdote that when they were talking about the rights of Arab citizens of Israel, and Einat mentioned the EU document or the benchmark of how the EU recommends that member states would treat minorities. So I looked it up. I opened it up, and of course you can read it on the internet. And as Einat said, this document mainly speaks about cultural and other rights, meaning that members of the minority group should be, they can run their schools in their own language, that teaching the language should not be forbidden, etc., etc., etc. And then this document was sent to each of the member states, and each member state had to respond how they are dealing with this. Now, as you know, the European continent is full of minorities, from World War I, World War II. We had enough trouble with that issue of Czechs and Slovaks and Germans in the Sudeten, etc., etc. So what was very striking to me was the response of the government of Spain. As you know, that we have Basque and Catalan, and many minorities who certainly, see themselves as separate, etc., etc. So the Spanish government sent back one sentence saying that there are no ethnic minorities in Spain. There's simply no minorities in Spain. So, ignoring everything and just saying that we just simply don't have minorities. So if Peter Beinart wants to start somewhere and feels that, there's a huge urge to rectify injustices, perhaps he can start with other countries and not with Israel.
Yes, I agree. That's a very good point. Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question, but before we do, so we can just finish, thank you both so much for being here today. It was really a great pleasure and a treat. I'm glad that so many people got to listen, and I'm glad that so many people will have the opportunity to listen because this recording will be made available. Again, if you would like to hear more conversations like this one, either with the authors of the books that we discuss in our book clubs or just with more Jewish thought leaders, please sign up to become a member at newzionists.org. I think I messed up the first time and said .com. It is 100% newzionists.org. Follow us on Twitter at New Zionists and on Instagram at New Zionist Congress. We really love to hear your suggestions on which conversations we should have next. And then my last question, because this relates to many of our members and our audience, is there are so many Jewish college students who understand these types of messages and who understand these ideas and who know why they should support Israel. They grew up in Zionist households. They feel passionate about Judaism and the state of Israel. And they are bewildered and really upset at the amount of opposition and virulent, emotional words and actions and student government resolutions that we have to experience on campus every day, whether it be just a comment made to us in a progressive organization meeting, whether it be eviction notices being hung on our doors, whether it be social media campaigns launched against us, whether it be resolutions to officially impeach us from student government, or defunding Hillel and Chabad on campus, or blacklisting students who choose to go on birthright. I mean, the list goes on and on. We've heard all about it. What would your advice be to break through the noise and to be the proudest and most authentic Zionist you can on campus, and do a good job of standing up for the Jewish people?
So I'll just say first, my heart goes out to the Jews because it's really about being a minority at a time when the majority is in crisis. So I think by now you don't need to spend too much time on campuses or in America to realize that all of this intense, insane emotion against Israel and Zionism has nothing to do with Israel and everything to do with America. I always, at one point I remember asking myself a very simple question. Has anti-Semitism ever been about the Jews? You know, when Christians massacred Jews during the Crusades, did the Jews do something in the 11th century that was different from what they did in the 10th century? No, what changed was what happening with the popes and Christianity. So it's very clear to me that what's happening right now is a crisis of America. And America is latching on to this moral ancient hatred as a way of finding certainty in an uncertain world, where it's not clear what it means to be American, what it means to be what are the goals. So I would say, at least in the Western world, there's one certainty you can always count on, which is the Jews did it. So you latch on to this certainty at times of crisis and uncertainty, but it's not because the Jews have done something different. It's because the countries are experiencing their own crisis. Of course, the difference now, at least with the existence of Israel, is that at least those countries the Jews have a choice. So as those countries are working through their crises, the Jews don't have to like have it be on their backs. So first of all, we have your back. If all else fails, we have your back in that sense. But what you're doing is wonderful. You're reclaiming Zionism not as an identity. It used to be said that Zionism in America is one Jew paying another Jew to send another Jew to live in Israel, right? That's not what you're doing. You're reclaiming the Zionist identity at the moment when Zionism is portrayed as evil. And rather than kind of fade into the background and let that pressure consume you, you're standing up to that. And that is the essence of Zionism. The essence of Zionism is to go against this effort to put Jews in their proper place and to reclaim our own identity for ourselves. And I think for a lot of Jews, it happens at a particular moment. I call it the pound of flesh moment. And I know it was reversed in Shakespeare, but normally it's the Jews who have to give the pound of flesh. I call it the pound of flesh moment. Jews basically are asked, the bar is always raised to what it is considered to be a good Jew. I used to be a good Jew for simply supporting Palestinian statehood and opposing the settlements. Try to say that today, you get laughed out of a room. Today, if you're not engaged in an exorcism ceremony against Zionism in Israel, you're not a good enough Jew. I joke that, Jews moved from AIPAC to J Street U to, if not now, to Jewish Voices for Peace. And right now, if you're not the Jewish co-chair of Students for Justice in Palestine, you're just not a good enough Jew. So the bar keeps on being raised. And I think what happens to every Jew is this pound of flesh moment. Initially, you hand over those pounds of flesh. Sure, I'll support this and I'll support this and I'll deny that and I'll say that. But I think at one point something cracks and you say to yourself, I'm not taking this anymore. There will never be enough pounds of flesh that will satisfy the other side, except when we're completely dead and we've given over all the pounds of flesh that we can. And I think a lot of Jews, that's the moment that they step back and they stop playing. And this is what happened to me. I was like a good Jew, from the left, supporting Palestinian statehood. And then I would speak on campuses and see, and this is 15 years ago, the virulent hatred. And at one point I was like, this is not about the settlements, right? And so what happened is I took a step back and I said, look, I still have the same opinions. I expressed them today. Partition, Palestinian statehood, against the settlements, all that. But I don't care about being a good Jew anymore. So I still have the same opinions, but I'm done trying. And I think ultimately a lot of young Jews will have that moment when they crack, and that's when they come join your organization.
I just have a few quick comments because Einat said it very well. I think that giving up never makes things better. So when you're dealing with aggressive, violent people, an aggressive and violent worldview, and giving them more and more and more will not satisfy them. They would simply want more and more and more. And as Einat said, I mean, my heart goes out to you because I assume what you're going through. But I think that the right way is to use whatever resources you have to fight back, because not fighting back is not the answer. It will not go away. I mean, sometimes people think, okay, it will go away. We'll simply keep silent and everything is going to be okay because we kind of don't have any other choice. I don't think that's true. I think that from what I have seen, usually giving up simply makes their appetite bigger and they'll be even more vocal, more aggressive, and only by fighting back you have some chance to regain your dignity and identity and your pride. So good for you. Excellent what you're doing, and we're really proud of you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Nobody respects a Jew who sells their people. They might give them a platform, they might give them accolades, but they're never respected.
The genesis of this organization started off as a, why are we giving up so much of ourselves and saying all these things that we don't believe in order to sit at a table, at the table of the cool kids at school, when the cool kids have made very clear since day one, and I'm speaking about, you know, liberal arts campuses with all of these progressive coalitions that really seek to marginalize us. We don't want to be a part of it anymore. We're done trying to be a part of it. That's not our message. That's not our mission. Zionism, like you said, Einat, is the spirit of saying, no, we're going to go build our own thing. We're going to go do our own thing. And we don't need your approval. And we don't need your protection. And I'm really inspired by that. And I'm even more inspired by it after this conversation. Thank you both again so much. For those of you listening into the audience, or for those of you listening later, if you haven't yet, please buy and read The War of Return, How Western Indulgence in the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. It's available anywhere you can buy books. We want to thank Dr. Einat Wilf and Mr. Adi Schwartz again for being here. Shavua Tov, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you later.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Toda rabah. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Toda rabah.
Thank you.